lesson for Daniel chapter 3. We will begin Daniel chapter 3 in our lesson. We'll continue on from what we talked about on Friday. So let's start with prayer and we'll get started on Daniel chapter 3. So let's pray. So Father, thank you for this time we have, an opportunity that we always are given by you to just be called your children, your servants, and help us to understand more of you and your word. Help us to just know you better, not for the purpose of just knowing for knowing's sake, but to meditate and reflect and understand the uniqueness that you give to us as not just being your creation, but having your hand on us to give us not just breath in our lungs, but a new spirit made alive. Then on top of that, you lead us into understanding of a depth of who you are and understand and discern your word for what you say. Help us to continue to depart from the traditions of men, the thoughts of our human nature, and to conform ourselves to you, to always vet ourselves, to always check ourselves. These examples and stories you give in Daniel, how you use these young men in a mighty way. Help us to understand and see that no matter how old we are, no matter how young we are, no matter what stacks against us in personality traits or backgrounds or abuse, help us to understand and know that we are called to a higher level of living, understanding, responding, and being an example of a light and salt to this world. And the more difficult situation these young men had among a king of all the kings of men, and among the situation, being so young, being in a place of their homeland and being stripped from there, you can't be any more dramatic and more abusive and conflicted in their thoughts and their emotions and their mental frame of spiritual journey and just a challenge to live for you, to stand up for you in the midst of the majority, in the midst of certain death, in the midst of tyranny and oppression and just the fear of the recourse, the consequence. Give us this sense of tenacity, this sense of growth that can not just be the beginning of our foundation of our faith, continuing to grow in us stronger and stronger as we see here today in this scripture in chapter 3, the continual growth of these young men as they become matured men in the faith. So help us to see us now, see you in your word the way we want us to see you. Be our counselor, our pastor, our teacher, our shepherd, our coming bridegroom, our everything. And we ask all this to be also the words of my mouth and meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock, our redeemer, our coming Lord and Savior. We ask you, Father, just ask all this in Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. All right, so morning everybody. Todd, Lee, Laney, Pam. So as we're going through today, I want to make one disclaimer, another mistake, yours truly. So I mentioned in the Diaglott that in chapter 3, Septuagint, I just did it again, see, I misspoke. In the Septuagint, I mentioned it was 8 years. I don't know, it's 18 years later, not 8. I don't know what's wrong with my brain cells. I misspoke. I'm like, why did I say 8? It's 18, clearly. It says that in the Septuagint, 18 years later. So I want to make sure I disclose that. So that's not, I wrote on the board, it's 16, so it's 18th year. So the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign was chapter 2. Therefore, we're 16 years later. So it's the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. So it's 16 years later. It's the 18th year, which means Daniel's 32 years old, not 22 years old. So I have to add 10 more years in there because of me misspeaking in my brain cells about what the Word of God said. Sorry, I made a mistake. So apologize for that. So it's the year 18 of Nebuchadnezzar, which, by the way, means, if you do the math from 605 to now, that means, guess what? We're in the last wave of captivity. So chapter 3 is an interesting chapter because, again, chapter 1, what's the earmark? Chapter 1 is the overview of what happened, where we're at in the timeline, 605 BC, and how Daniel at 13 years of age, along with his other 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are taken away with other Hebrew children, but those 4 uniquely blessed by God. Then we see them being put into the king's chamber, and then it says in chapter 1, verse 4, 5, and 6, the uniqueness of how they have wisdom and discernment and learning and understanding. And yet those ones of the sons of Judah, those 4, are uniquely blessed among the other Hebrew kids and the others of the Assyrian and Chaldean ilk of the king's chamber. And the king had this rule with Ashpenaz to instruct him for 3 years. So then he has Melzar, who is the steward under him, Ashpenaz, that Daniel first gets a no from Ashpenaz, then gets a yes from Melzar, and to do the 10-day trial, and then he gets this idea of, okay, let's do our own drink and our own water. He eats pulse, that which is pulled off a tree, not what's in the ground. Speaking of that which is built up upon the Word of God, not just what's in the Word of God. It's the depth of understanding why he says in 1 Corinthians 3, 10 to 15, The foundation is Christ, and you build up upon that, right? So it's talking about building up upon your faith, not just the sporos or the sporos 100-fold fruit, but the sperma and the 30, 60, 100. So we're going to see with these four men, then later on in chapter 1, he ends up by saying they all had this wisdom and they all had this knowledge and this discernment, this skuthathuno, that had them circumspectly see themselves in the situation for what it was and see how they should respond, how they should react, how they can see themselves and what it is. But Daniel alone understood and interpreted visions and dreams. It says clearly to us he was unique in that way. We know Daniel's type of the faithful ones, and the others are types of the soon medical who will become faithful ones later, which is why they're seen as one but yet also different. Because they are both faithful ones but at different times. Daniel represents those in wave 1 are taken out, and then also you got wave 4 when the others are taken out at the end at the tribulation period to then join those, which is what 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 and 18 is talking about, those who are alive and remain and are left over to the parousia, presence of the Lord. Don't believe your King James coming of the Lord aspect in 1 Thessalonians 4:15. That's a parousia that speaks to the end of tribulation. That's what those are the people on Mount Zion in Revelation 14. So with that being said, chapter 2 then elaborates on what happened at the end of chapter 1. So chapter 1 is this foreshadow of what was going to happen from the beginning through the first 3 years. And then chapter 2 now is going to expound, well, how did Daniel find this favor? And then his friends, his close companions, as he calls them in chapter 2. Then we read about that story, and we saw Daniel's earmark of how he could really learn quite a bit of lessons from him as a 16-year-old young man, how he responded and interacted with how to handle conflict when there's a superior person over you. We saw that on Friday, right? He didn't appeal to the ego. He didn't try to deflect and justify. He didn't, try to just, hypocritically say, I'm saying one thing and now doing another because of what the Chaldeans were doing. They're saying they talk to the gods, but only the gods would know. Well, then precisely why don't you know them? Whereas Daniel did the opposite. He didn't stroke the ego or appeal to man. He appealed to God, and when he went to the reason, he wanted to be a peacemaker. He wanted to diffuse. He asked Arioch why the harsh decree. Reasoned with him. Arioch stopped and listened to him. He stopped, he listened, he answered. Then we find Daniel actually bringing resolution to the table. Give me a time with the king. Then we find that Daniel then relies upon God. Ask his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, pray that God would give to me the secret. God gives him the understanding. Then he thanks and praises God for that. Then he goes to an ignorant person who knows nothing about the God of Israel, Nebuchadnezzar, and he then conveys to him that what's about to be told to him is what God had told him a dream of a future event, and that God and God alone told Daniel what that dream was and what it meant. He made sure when he delivered that process of drawing from the knowledge and experience with God, handling the conflict correctly with reason, resolution, and dependence on God. And then he also ended by thanking and praising God. When he did all that process internally, introspectively, then when it came time to actually practically apply it, what do? He actually gets to the place where he deflects any credit from himself. He deflects any accolades for himself and says, nope, has nothing to do with me. This is all of God. And then Nebuchadnezzar, from this example he gave, then explains what the dream was and what it means. Then Nebuchadnezzar's response was to worship him. And we saw that, not because of him saying he's a god, no, because Daniel had the embodiment of God's wisdom and trustworthiness in him, and it just floored Nebuchadnezzar, like, holy moly. 16-year-old young man, this 16-year-old young man is so impressionable upon, he's left an indelible impression upon Nebuchadnezzar, a king of all kings of men, who doesn't kowtow to nobody. And here he is impressed by a 16-year-old young man. Imagine what the king's cabinet, all of the other people in the kingdom must have been thinking, how he, the king of kings of all men, is bowing down to worship a 16-year-old because he embodies the wisdom and trustworthiness of God. Is the king deceived and delusional? Or do we then follow suit and make sure we respect the fact that, oh my goodness gracious, the king, no one dare say he's crazy. No one dare say he's off his rocker. No one dare say, how are you being so incredulous to this slave, to this person you took in captivity? No one did that, right? They align with him. Which goes back to the summation of chapter 2. We end up by him then exalting Daniel over the whole province and the chief of the governors, which is the government officials. And then Daniel requests to have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but he calls them their Babylonian names as a respect to Nebuchadnezzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He asked for them to be over the office, over the affairs, the service, the work, kind of like on the beat, on the streets, overseeing something. They weren't chief officials. They weren't like government officials. They weren't of the ilk of his cabinet. They're just like on the lower level of overseeing things. They have some type of responsibility, right? He wanted them to have something, and so the king said, fine, right? That's how chapter 2 ends. But we also find that within chapter 2 and chapter 1, the gleanings that we find are just so many. And we find these applications of how to live our lives, how to get to the place where Daniel and his friends didn't earn or deserve any of this wisdom and skilled discernment and introspection, and him himself understanding visions and dreams. He even said, if it's of God, it's of God. Ask God to give me the understanding. The secret, which means I don't know the unknown. Let God make it known to me. And if he does, he does. But what's interesting is the sovereignty of God is like shot up from the mountaintops in the first 2 chapters. How do I explain? How do anybody explain how this group of 13-year-old young men have been moved by God with their hand of God on them? How can you explain that from a standpoint of, oh, that's normal? No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. Then you got the conformity test, as psychology tells us, that 3/4 of the time you put 7 people in a room and they tell 6 of them to purposely lie, to test and vet the courage of the one who's the real test subject, doesn't know it. And you say, they did the test, so here's the 3-inch line on this side of the ledger, and over here there's a 3-inch line, there's a 4-inch line, a 10-inch line, and a 12-inch line. Which one of these lines looks similar to the 3-inch line? Well, obviously it's the 4-inch line, right? But they tell the other 6 to lie and say it's the 10-inch line. It looks more close to the 3-inch, not the 4-inch. And each time one of those people says this, the 10-inch looks more to the 1-inch, they found in psychology circles of the conformity test that 3/4 of people will then kowtow and just give in to the pressure of the majority and say, oh, it's the 3-inch line that looks closer to the 10-inch line looks closer to the 3-inch, when the 4-inch is right there, which is the obvious answer. Only 1 in 4 people, 25% of the time, will people stand up to what's right and do what's right. Adults! Here are 4 young men saying, I'm not going to conform. Now, Daniel's leading the way, don't get me wrong. He's the one who voiced it. He's the one who God used. He's the one who God said. But the other 3 could have said, I'm not with your program, brother. They seem to be right in alignment with him, which could speak to their conformity to him. Okay. But you could say not 4, but only 1. But still, nonetheless, the point is, it's not normal. It's not normal to what Daniel exhibiting to us, or God shows us in chapter 1. It is not normal. Normalcy is where the majority lies, right? What is normalcy? Where the majority, where the propensity, where the probability is greater. That's normalcy, right? He went against the probability. He went against the testing of what conformity does to us at 13 years of age. He's already shown it. God's already shown us, hey, guys, pay attention. I'm a special kid here I got. Special young man. Special young man I'm going to have my hand on. Kind of like a Job situation. Kind of like a Moses situation. No more humble than anybody in the land at that time than Moses. Like an Abraham situation, like an Abram. I'm going to call him out of the Ur of the Chaldees. God's done this multiple times, made a unique impression, not because of the person, because of him making an indelible difference on that person more than any other. There was no greater prophet than Moses. There was no one that he called from the polytheists except save Abram. Right? He made a new people out of him. He made out of Job, the one he loved on the most, put a garrison of angels around him. No one else did that too. And here we have Daniel, this another uniqueness. Here's a young man at 13 years of age. He has never before shown us this in the scripture, or before or since, how a person could be so ridiculously endowed by God's wisdom and trustworthiness and tenacity to just know the truth and to be so adamant about it. And we see glimpses of that with King David, but not like this. Not a triptych of, we see a story of him having the lions delivered into King David's hand and the bear. Okay, great. Not like this. This is him for 3 years, taken from his homeland, robbed of his parents, stripped from his familiarities, his surroundings, taken away into a slave trade. The mental frame of mind is scarred and abused on this traversing trip of about 900 miles from Jerusalem area to Babylon. Then he gets there over a month of a journey, and what does he find? He finds that he's just like nothing happened. He's just stonewalled the conformity. He stonewalls the peer pressure. He stonewalls all this other stuff that is normalcy to human beings' behaviors in that situation. I know being abused, it's very difficult to stand up for what is right, to have the courage to do what is right, to have the tenacity to do what is right, let alone to do it in the right way. I mean, to me, it's just so mind-blowing to me. The mental frame, the spiritual, the girth, And I know he's spiritually dead too, which tells me that I know that God is definitively doing this in his life. It is not like him. No, God is making a point to us to show us what he's capable of. And a dead spiritual person, because no one's alive spiritually until Jesus came, lived, died, rose again from the dead, your spirit's dead. So all he had at best was the Holy Spirit alongside of him. I get that. But boy, did God work in his life. Holy moly. It was unbelievable. Okay? So, in a sense of human standpoint, but it's believable when it comes to God. So this is the image you have to understand. And then this whole way, and 3 years later, he's 16. The way he handles the dynamic of confrontation and conflict was just unreal. And then the reaction he got from Nebuchadnezzar, that's how we left it going into chapter 3. Chapter 3, we saw the introduction. Now it's the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. It's 16 years later. I made a mistake last Friday and said it was only 6 years. So it's 16 years. So Daniel's 32 years old. And because it's the year of 586 BC, doing the math, that makes us know that we're at the last year of the 3 waves of captivity, of 605, 597, and now 586. So you go, wait a second. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is, what do you think Daniel is? Daniel he's the chief of all the government. He oversees, he's not an overseer of a province. He oversees the whole province, and he's the chief of all the people throughout the Babylonian kingdom. He doesn't say he's second to the king, but it sure sounds like a position really akin to and similar to Joseph and the Pharaoh back in the day. Sounds real similar to that. Didn't say it was like that, but it alludes to that when you say he's over the whole province, and you secondly then add to that he's the chief of all the government officials. It sounds like he is the Secretary of State. It sounds like he's the Secretary of State or Vice President and the U.S. government mindset of hierarchy, right? He's of that frame. He's over everybody who's an officer of the government. What do you call that person? We call that person Commander-in-Chief, but he's not that, because that's Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king. So what is he then? He's either Vice President or he's Secretary of State, and our kin of our government equivalency, right? That's what he is. And so that's why he's not there. He's more than likely over in Judea. And why would he not be, since he is a Hebrew? Why would he not be overseeing his people that are going to be taken away, overseeing that activity, which is a long month's journey from Judea to Babylon? It's a 3 to 6 month journey, easy. And if not to mention, could be even longer, right? And by the way, you have the fact that Daniel is traversing, by the way, and Nebuchadnezzar is making this image. So think about the idea of what's going on here. So wave 3 it's already in action. It's either been completed or it's in process of. One of the two is true. It's in the process of being done or it's being completed. That's the year we're in, 586 BC, chapter 3. Then on top of that, Nebuchadnezzar then is starting to think about the dream that Daniel told him about this huge image, and he built an image that's 90 foot tall and 108 feet wide. And so I didn't have the numbers last time. I apologize for that, not doing the math. But you got to remember that this is the imagery I wanted to get for scale and memory, because that's how we are as humans. We want something to compare it to appreciate. What does that look like? Well, that looks like the Christmas tree in New York when they set up this huge Christmas tree. Was it in downtown New York, right? They set it right up in the ice skating rink and all that stuff. So that Christmas tree is between 80 and 100 feet tall. And it's about 40 to 50 feet in width. So the width of Nebuchadnezzar's image was twice as wide as the Christmas tree you see in New York, but the height of it was pretty similar. So think about that. That's a pretty big image, right? To get scale for what you understand in your brain cells. We're coming up on the Christmas season, so it's interesting to note that that's kind of how you can remember that. I'll never forget. In my mind, I'm always going to put the Christmas tree of New York, the big Christmas tree they put up. I'm going to compare it now to like, oh my gosh, that's how big a similitude of the height, but the width was twice as wide as the image that Nebuchadnezzar had put up. The difference is Nebuchadnezzar's image was made of gold, not of clay, not of stone, gold, which makes it a lot harder. It takes a lot, the more solid, the longer it takes to carve out, right? The details. And start looking at, I looked up different aspects of people that are sculptors, how long it takes them to do this, and so the math is, depending on if it's just one guy doing it, you know, it could take a long time. months, sometimes years, to that size. So my guess is that this image that Nebuchadnezzar was constructing took about 6 to 12 months to finish, depending on how much detail. I don't know how much detail he put into it. The detail says everything about the length of time and the number of people working on it, right? We don't know how many folks worked on it. We don't know the number of details he had in it. It could be as short as 3 months. I'll give you that. No less than 3 months. I can tell that right now. No less than 3, no more than 12. Somewhere in that range is how long it took to make this image, just based on basic sculpturing 101. You don't do something like that size within 2 days or 2 weeks. Ain't gonna happen. There's no way. No way. You don't make a 90-foot, 108-foot wide statue image out of gold like that. It takes time. Now, the number of people you have, again, and the number of details you do or don't have can speak to how much that time is. But again, I put forth to you 3 to 12 months. I find it coincidental that the journey from Judea over to Babylon is 3 to 6 months, depending on when you start, how many people you have, how many times you have to stop for. What a coincidence. So now we know where Daniel's at, don't we? He's overseeing the third wave. Why would he not oversee the Hebrew people? Why would he not oversee the king's, hey, go get the last group of folks, bring them over. You are my chief of all the governors. You oversee the whole problem. Go get them. That's where he's at. He's months away. So by the time he's doing all that, the king is celebrating and commemorating his finality, it seems like. And he's also reimagining 16 years later the image that Daniel told him. And he's now going to build this image that Daniel talked about. I'm going to build what I saw because I am the head of gold. And I am the King of Kings. I have this power and honor and might, is what Daniel's God told me that I am, so I'm going to be all that. So it took him 16 years for this arrogance and pride to fester up. It's almost as if it reminds me of King Solomon and how when he distanced himself from his mother Bathsheba, later on in his life he recalled that was a mistake that led him off the rails. It reminds me of many times when people start right but then get off the rails. They go into the carnal backsliding mindset. It's because of the main ingredient. I don't care if you're a man or a woman or white or black or brown, culture, ethnicity, whatever. When everybody starts, and I don't care, any human who starts right with God and then gets off the. Moses started with as the most humble person. And what was he known for as being disinherited, not going to the promised land? Because of his anger and frustration. The very opposite of what you would think a humble person would do. But it all started with what? It started with the sense that you lose sight and you lost track of the perspective of who you are in God's eyes. Because Moses kept saying, I didn't ask for this, right? Nebuchadnezzar's like, I'm saying to you, he lost touch with the influence of Daniel. He lost touch with the influence of God's truth. And that was because Daniel wasn't there all the time. He lost touch. He didn't have that constant interaction with Daniel. I think this speaks to this 16 year later, speaks to his, remember, that's 16 years, that's 8 times 2. That's division and testimony against resurrections. And we know there's a resurrection and an out-resurrection. And we know the out-resurrection is what Paul says he wants to strain and gain and he wants to attain. And that's what we're supposed to want to have as the faithful ones. They go through 2 resurrections. I don't find it coincidental that 16 years later, and here we are, we're going to find now a demarcation of how the different demarcation of contrast between Nebuchadnezzar, a person who was exposed to the things of truth but didn't foster it, didn't develop it, didn't cultivate it. Look where it led him, pride and arrogance, to make an image unto himself. We see Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we see them reacting positively, and we see them much more like they're acting like Daniel now in this chapter. We're going to see chapter 3 now show their character trait that is in similitude to what we saw Daniel do in chapter 2. They learned the lesson from Daniel and his example. 16 years later, they're embodying it now, also being people about 32 years of age. They're now men. And here we are in Nebuchadnezzar. He does the opposite. He becomes carnal and distant and forgetful. Because when you don't, it just speaks to the fact that some people go, oh, that person's living like this, that person's acting like that, they're not saved. Don't tell me Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know who God is. Yes, he does. He said so, he knew so, he acknowledged so in chapter 2. I don't care what he does later. It doesn't negate the fact of what he said, of what he understood, what he acknowledged, his actions. You see that he knows who the one true God is. We know that. So why did 16 years later him develop this idea, I'm going to put an image up of gold? Why? What does that speak to? It speaks to it doesn't matter who you are in Christ. If you do not cultivate and develop and work on your relationship with God, you will look and live and act and talk and think just like somebody who's a dillweed and ignoramus of nothing to do with God and His Word. People will question your salvation. Yes, they will. And I understand why they do it. It's wrong, but I understand why they do it. Because you don't look, smell, you don't pass the smell test. They look at you and go, that doesn't look like somebody that believes in Jesus. They don't talk like somebody like that. They don't act like somebody like that. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar is doing in chapter 3. He's not showing he's not saved or not knowing who God is. He's showing that this is the recourse, this is the consequence, this is the product of a 16-year grieving of the Holy Spirit. He didn't do that then. We do that now in contrast. What he did is he ignored God. He ignored the truth of God. He ignored the manifestation of that day which he should never, ever have forgotten. You say, how could he? Oh, well, come on, man. Of course you forgot. No. Bullarchy. He's a king of all kings. What can stay his hand? No one. And nothing. Which is why later on, God makes that very statement to him in chapter 4. We're going to get there. When he said, no one can stay my hand and say to me, what doest thou? The reason he said that is because the king of kings of men, Nebuchadnezzar, knew no one tells him what to do. No one. And nothing. He determines what to do, how to do it, when to do it, whenever he wants to do it. And he said in chapter 2, I am ticked. I am livid. I am angry. Kill all the wise men. So why didn't you do it? Why did you wait the next day to hear from Daniel? Why is that? What does that mean, Nebuchadnezzar? He knows what it meant because God changed his mind. God changed his heart. God changed everything about that situation and made him say, be still. Arioch, remember the tough captain of his guard, what did he do? Same thing. What stays his hand? Only one person, Nebuchadnezzar. No one else tells Arioch what to do but the king. No one else tells him to stop and listen and respond except for the king until that day when God said, shut your pie hole. Got my 16-year-old young man want to talk to you for a second. What? And Arioch just stops, listens, answers. Two men that are based on testosterone laden, I do what I want when I want. Nebuchadnezzar answered to no one. Arioch, I followed the king. And both of them were just shut down by the sovereignty of God. Just shut down. Changed. Just like that. And they were like, dude, listening to you. So much for man's free will. So much for that. It's just like, it reminds me of John 7. You had to seize Jesus 3 times. How'd that work out for you? You didn't do it, did you? Looks like your will wanted to. You had the ability to. You were in power to do it. So why didn't you do it? What's the matter? What happened? Oh, because God didn't let you do it. Just like Nebuchadnezzar and Arioch. God didn't let them carry on with, in Nebuchadnezzar's case, his fury, his anger. He didn't let Arioch carry on. Chapter 3 carries on now with that's the background. 16 years later, you're going to tell me you forgot about that? You forgot about the one and only time in your rule early on where God made an indelible impression that your will was thwarted. Your decree was not followed. The captain of your guard was stopped in his tracks by a 16-year-old young man, the one that you worshipped. You don't forget that? I don't believe that for a second. He remembered that for the rest of his life. The difference was he didn't cultivate it. He didn't develop it. He didn't meditate on it. He didn't ponder what the ramifications of that was, of how he should be conducting himself in his kingdom. Seemed to be okay for 16 years. But then 16 years later, arrogance and pompousness and the fleshiness of man, it always wins out because our old fleshy man, our spirit man needs to be fed. We need to feed him by the word of God. But the old man, he's like a weed. He grows no matter what, Jack. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't thwart the old flesh, the old carnal thinking of his arrogance and his piety. And 16 years later, it rears his ugly head by him saying, build me an image. 90 feet tall, 180 feet wide. Really? Like the image that Daniel showed me about. You mean the experience you had, what I just talked about? The things you can never, ever forget mentally, emotionally, spiritually, how you were convicted to your core of your soul? You mean that? You mean that moment in time when your mind was always consciously aware that for the first time ever you were aware of an upright living God who was way bigger than your stoned and stick gods that you were so dumb enough to believe were the real gods? And you knew back then the one true God is all that? And he proved it by taking the unknown that you didn't even remember your dream. And Daniel told it to you and what it meant. Come on, man. Of course you don't forget that. He just lived like he didn't care about it. He didn't value it. He didn't uphold it with high priority. This is the problem we're learning about chapter 3. But in the meantime, the contrast is the 3 Hebrew children that were in that area as over the affairs. Oh, they did embody that. Oh, they did have that resonate with them. You do see the benefits of them cultivating and developing and recalling and thinking. I remember when Daniel asked us to pray. I remember when God gave him the answer. I remember when we all understood, but then he is the one that understood, interpreted the visions and dreams, but we understood that God was going to give him. I remember that. I remember being there and Daniel knowing what the king didn't even remember. I remember Daniel telling him, and we all knew it was God who did it. And they're showing a 16-year contrast of how people who do meditate on God's word, who do spend time reflecting on God's experiences in their life, who do spend the time digging deeper into God's knowledge of what he's given them and appreciation and gratitude. They show the difference in dynamic of 16 years later, what that looks like in a person, what that looks like in a young man. It looks like courage. It looks like tenacity. It looks like no fear. It looks like calmness under pressure. It looks like a backbone to stand up when the majority is against you. It looks like nothing else matters but how you stand before your God. No one and nothing sways your hand. That's what it looks like. But you're about to find out chapter 3. So we go back to chapter 3, but that is the background. Sorry for my epitaph there, but I can't even, you've got to get this picture in your head of what is happening and what is really unfolding here, practically speaking, in their time frame. So the Septuagint helps us out with that 18-year difference, or 18th year, the 16-year difference, 18th year, which means a 16-year difference based on chapter 2. So he builds the shoe statue in the valley of Dura, which is the northwest side of the Babylonian kingdom, which is a good 300 miles away from Babylon proper. But in verse 2 and 3, he gathers governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and rulers. He does it again in chapter 3, verse 3. Chapters 3, verse 2 and 3 both list the same 8 groups of people, which I find interesting because over in Revelation 13, and 15, and 16, when the image is put up by the false prophet, he forces all those that are little and great. Remember that? And rich and poor and free and bondmen. There's 6 groups of people when it comes to the image of the beast in Revelation, which this is a foreshadow of. There's 8 groups here. Why is there 8 here, but there's 6 there? The difference is because there, the 6 groups were showing the identity of the men on the earth. The focus was not on the Sun Medicoi. The focus was on the dominance of the beast, who is now the opponent, Satan incarnate, him the beast, inside the body of Antichrist, and Satan himself as the dragon. It shows their total power and authority over all men. 6, the number of men. Rich, poor, little, great, free, bond, doesn't matter. They have the authority over all of them. Can't hurt the Sun Medicoi, but they're over them. They're enduring this garbage. Then you have, in Daniel, it's 8 groups. Why is there 8 groups of people? Because he's not talking about so much as it is the authority of evil over man. In this case, Satan's image later on. This is talking about the different demarcation of those 8. 8 speaks of resurrection, of the resurrection of the new life that is endured by these 3 Hebrew children, in lieu of what was stacked against them. Later on, they're going to describe it, and they're going to say, we don't serve, nor do we worship God. Sound familiar? Remember that? Because the 2 demarcations, serve and worship. You say, what's that mean? Well, because remember, there's a taking the mark of the beast, there's on your right hand or on your forehead. One speaks to service of countdown to the service. I got to go buy and trade on your right hand. One speaks to the forehead that you worship him. You don't find that coincidental? Really? You don't find that coincidental at all? In Revelation 13, there's 2 different earmarks of the forehead and the hand. And here in Daniel 3, you're going to see it repeatedly being said. They don't serve or worship other gods. What's the difference? What's the difference? One means I don't pay homage to a God. That's not true. Worship. Serve. I don't base my life or base my actions or listen to anything that comes from a decree or from a statement from some Yahoo wackadoodle stone stick false deity. That's what he's talking about. Serve means I don't have anything influence me, which is the right hand mark issue. And worship is the forehead issue. What a coincidence. You tell me why it says serve and worship. Why do folks always overlook this? They're two different words. Because they mean two different things. And later on they're going to say, next is going to say, only you should serve and worship only the true God. So we go back to chapter 3 and we look at this. Then we see in chapter 3 that these 8 groups, it says in verse 3 that the king had set up these 8 groups of people are the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, the rulers. And the word governors is like government official. The rest of them are self-explanatory. The judge like a magistrate, treasurer, those over the money. Counselors like the chief astrologers and the Chaldeans, the wise men people. And the sheriffs are like people that are lawyers, and then rulers means just that. People overseeing things, rulers, right? And of the provinces. And they were gathered together in verse 3, the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image. So I want you to know this is a groundbreaking ceremony that Nebuchadnezzar has been working on this. I don't believe this is a finished product being talked about in chapter 3, verse 3. I believe this is Nebuchadnezzar doing a groundbreaking ceremony saying, I'm building this image right now. And I want you to know, I want you all here for the groundbreaking ceremony. And I want you all to acknowledge that when this thing is done in about 3 to 6 to 12 months max, there's going to be rules about this. I want you all to know. They're there for the groundbreaking ceremony. That's why it's called the dedication. Right? So that's what you do, right? Someone could say, well, it's already been done, and now he's dedicating it. Could be. But the way in which this leads to later on, when it talks about what's going to happen, and then from that, that's what you do, and then later on in verse 7 and 8, then after a time, because of those two allures to how it's a future timeline, it makes me think it's a groundbreaking ceremony. It wasn't completed. It was going to be completed pretty soon, 3 months minimum, 12 months maximum in that frame, and that's why they're getting brought here to be dedicated, to let them know the rules of engagement around what I'm doing and what's going to be encompassing what this means to you and people in my kingdom. Then he goes into saying in verse 4, then a herald cried out, and it said, commanded all people, nations, and languages. Another interesting contrast to Revelation. When you contrast Revelation 17:5, the harlot was over people, nations, languages, and crowds. Left out crowds here. But the harlot was what? In Revelation, to test your knowledge. Remember, the mother of all harlots is Israel, who's the woman. But the harlot was what? A false religious establishment of the Catholic Church. What a coincidence. What is this image? A false religious establishment to worship something that's not true. The symmetry is clear to me. Crystal clear to me. There's groups in view with the dedication like there was in Revelation 13. 8 verses 6, but we see why. One's focused on the authority of the Antichrist, now the beast. One's over in Revelation. And Daniel 3, the focus is on the overcoming of these 3 Hebrew children we're about to find out about. That's why there's 8 groups to show their pathway and their righteous works that they're showing to have not just the resurrection, but an out-resurrection. That's why 8 is in view here, to show their distinctive difference between these 8 versus them. Because all the other 8, they kowtow. And then you find, he says, oh, by the way, the heralder heralds out to peoples and nations and languages. This is not the heralder. So the Nebuchadnezzar is like Satan setting up an image, and the heralder is like the false prophet who calls out and says, you got to come worship. What a coincidence. Not the king saying, he has a heralder who says that. Then as you see, and then later on you see, okay, then you're going into chapter 3 and verse 4 and verse 5 now, when he says that at what time you hear the voice of the cornet, which is a small trumpet, a flute, a harp, a sackbut, just so you know, it's a weird word. It means like a trombone back in the day. And then a dulcimer, a psaltery and a dulcimer. A psaltery is like a little funky, I call it the Star Trek Spock looking, harp looking thing. It's like a Russian, like a ukulele meets a lyre, and it had a baby. It looks really weird. Like it's like a weird looking So it's a string instrument, okay? So, and then there's a psaltery, and there's a dulcimer. That's the psaltery, then dulcimer. But you look at all these instruments, there's brass, there's string, and there's woodwinds. You go, there is? Yes. Brass is the horn, small trumpet. The trombone, the sackbut. The string is the harp, and the dulcimer, and the psaltery, and the woodwind is the flute. You have 3 kinds of instruments. Is that the full ensemble? What's missing from that? What's missing? Ask any musician what's missing from string, brass, woodwind. What's missing? Percussion. Percussion. That's interesting. Because in Psalm 150, when he says all things praise the Lord, you know what God mentions? All 4. He mentions percussion. You go, he does? Tambourine is percussion. It's the percussion family. God mentions all 4 instruments when you praise him. All 4. Why am I bringing that up for? I think it's interesting that God, I always ask the question, why does God do what he does? Does he just list things to list things? No, there's a reason for everything God does. Why he lists these instruments, to show us brass, string, woodwinds. Look how Satan falls short in the image of Nebuchadnezzar. He falls short of the worship he so desires. The worship that only God deserves, only God has, is the full ensemble of our praise. It engages our spirit, our mind, our soul, our body. It engages all of us. It worships all of him in his fullness. I think this idea that percussion is left out, I think it's interesting. I think it's a mockery of how Satan and the person Nebuchadnezzar and his worldly man-made, I want this greed and arrogance, pride to myself. It just shows how we always fall short. I love how Psalm 150 lists all 4 of the strings, brass, woodwinds, and percussion. The full ensemble of praise. Ask a person in orchestra, hey, is that a full ensemble if I leave out percussion? No, it is not. You need all 4 of those. Not 3. That's not an ensemble. Don't lie. Don't even go there. No, it's not. You need all 4. If you ever seen or heard a symphony before, seen an orchestra pit, they got all 4, Jack. All 4. They got brass, string, woodwind, and percussion. No percussion here. I find it to be interesting. God's way of saying, he falls short of the worship he desires, as he always will. I love it. I think it's great. So then he goes into verse 6. And verse 5, of course, he says, when you hear these things, and all kinds of music psalming, and the word is all kind of music, that means the word song, that means a music set to song. In other words, you're going to hear these instruments of string, brass, and woodwinds, and you'll hear some songs being sung. When you hear the songs with the music, when you hear that, you're supposed to fall down and worship. All kinds of music. All kinds of music means anytime you hear any of those instruments, string, woodwind, or brass, and you hear the accompanying song with it, which is what a psalm is an ode set to music. My Church of Christ friends, I love it. There's no instruments allowed in the church because that's what the... Well, in Ephesians it says, speak to each other in songs and psalms, which is a song set to music, and you're welcome. It means instruments. Wake up, people. Well, my pastor's playing. Well, he's wrong. He's wrong. Look up the word song. It's an ode set to music. Hello. An instrument's involved. An instrument with singing together means music. Well, it's a cappella. Nothing wrong with that, but don't tell me it's the only way to do it. You're just being legalistic and closed-minded. Then you go back to chapter 3 when he says in verse 6, after he tells them you got to fall down and worship, and in verse 6, whoever doesn't do this, in that same hour will be cast in the burning fiery furnace. That means in that instant, immediately, without hesitation. Without hesitation. This is important to understand. Without hesitation. You hear the music, you hear a string, you hear a woodwind, you hear brass, you start to hear singing, you fall down and you worship. If you don't, just like that, throw you in the furnace. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to contemplate it. I'm not going to get a vote. I'm going to cast you right in. That's the verb. I didn't write it. That's the verbiage, which is, I'm emphasizing this because that's not what happened with the 3 Hebrew children. The king had a conversation with them. What happened with the immediacy, king? Just asking for a friend. Because your decree said, right away, forthwith, no questions asked, throw him in. So why the conversation? So why not the immediacy? Again, we see the king again being moved by God to go against his own words, his own decree. With Daniel, he says, kill them all, now. Waits till the next day, they're all not dead, and he listens to Daniel. What? That's opposite of what you just said. And you knew then, 16 years ago, that God's the one who did that to your mind and to your will. He bent it to his sovereign will. Did he not? Back then, 16 years ago, Nebuchadnezzar, he'd be, oh, yeah, he sure did, I remember, wait. 16 years later, he forgot that. He's about to find out again how God bends his so-called will to God's sovereign will. He's seeing it right here. It's just, you can't miss this, man. Nebuchadnezzar said at that very moment, you don't do what you're supposed to do. When you hear the string and the brass and the woodwind, and you hear the songs, you better bow, you better fall down and worship. That means on your knee and then go forward. You can't just go like that, like do at sporting arenas, which I hate people do that. I hate that. Hate that. That means booty in the air. That means on your face, booty in the air, face down. He goes, what you going to do when you hear the song, when you hear the flute, the woodwind, or the string, and you hear the song, you get on your face. In the direction of the statue, that's right. Like the Muslim people do, right? They do that in that whole, right? They do that toward Mecca. And then he says in that very immediate reality. So, interesting, by the way. Interesting. Verse 7. So again, you got this verse 5. From verse 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, to me, all these things speak to not an immediacy of what is happening and what's going to happen, which again goes back to, I believe, this is a groundbreaking celebration, entrance into chapter 3, about him breaking ground on this project, and he's letting them know what this project is and what it entails, and this is why it's different demarcation. And remember, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, which is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not there. They weren't there. Why? Because they weren't of the chief ilk of the government cabinet. They were like lowly people that oversee the work, the affairs, the service. Not the same thing as these higher level people. So they weren't there. And by the way, did they hear about it over the time that the 3 to 12 month project was going on? Of course they did. Which means the entire time, they already knew in their heart, when that thing gets done, we ain't doing that. Ain't gonna happen. Why is that important to understand? Because I believe this speaks to the tribulation period. That there's certain people in tribulation in the first half, if you're aware and you know you're not of the second and third, well, you're not going to know this, but there's some people that they're going to realize that they don't know that they're going to be gone or not. They're not going to know about a second and third wave. All they know is if they're here, they're thinking they're here for the long haul. If they're here for the long haul, in the back of their mind, what are they thinking? When this mark of the beast comes, what's going to happen? We're not going to do it. No, we ain't going to do it. Ain't going to do it. They're not doing it. They've already made their mind up. They're not going to do that. Hundredfold saints, the majority of them, I would say, if not all of them, are not going to do that garbage. They're going to be here for the whole thing. They're not going to do that. They're like, that's a no. Whether I knew it or not, I believed it or not, the rapture wasn't the beginning, I'm not out of here. Okay, fine. They're not going to give into that. They're not doing it. They give their lives, as a matter of fact. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're a word picture of those who had a demarcation of, I'm not going to do this because my hundredfold fruit tells me enough whether I know or not what's going on. But in their case, they're the soon medicoi people that become advanced in their faith because they're 16 years later drawing from all they already experienced in the king's cabinet. And now with the Daniel Nebuchadnezzar experience in the mystery situation with the dream, boy, they are a lot higher. They represent both aspects of this mindset of, we already have our mind locked in, we're not doing this. Whether you complete it or not in 3 months, 6 months, it doesn't matter. Not only other people, but all the nations. Hard to follow up on that. Yeah, so it means that remember that the nations is an idea of the people that Nebuchadnezzar has conquered and brought under his reign. Because Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom reigned from Babylon all the way to Asia Minor down to Judea. So there's many ethnicities, many countries that he had conquered. So what he means is, when you traverse and give him tribute, when you traverse and do business in Babylon, when you're in this area of this valley of Dura, and you hear the music go off, which, by the way, also speaks to the fact it wasn't an immediate, he was announcing this groundbreaking ceremony because it took a time. It took 3 to 12 months to make the image, and in that time, what was going on? Why were all the people there? Because they were traversing through their provinces, telling everybody, hey, just so you know, when you guys traverse from 1,200 miles due west, when you come east to the valley of Dura to go through there to Babylon, just so you know, when you hear string, brass, and woodwinds, and you hear singing, you fall down and you worship the beast. The image, I should say. Excuse me. Worship the image, which is the foreshadow of the beast. Worship the image of Nebuchadnezzar's big gold statue. You better worship that. If you don't, just like that, he's going to throw you in the fire. He ain't playing. They're like, okay. Yes, sir. You know, that's why they were there. To carry that word throughout their provinces they were overseeing in this massive empire of Babylon. Which was overseeing more than just Babylonian people. It was overseeing Assyrian people, Judea people, and other people from Asia Minor, right? So that were of that descent. So you have different people of different countries, all under the Babylonian Empire, and then because they had conquered. And so when you get this idea, down go in chapter 3, you keep reading, and this is the background of this, and then he goes into verse 7, saying, therefore, at that time, at that appointed time, now he's fast forwarding. So first, the rules of engagement, the groundbreaking ceremony, the rules of engagement of what's going to be entailed when it's finished. Now chapter 3, verse 7 and 8, it's telling you it's done. Now we're fast forwarding 3 to 12 months in the future now. And chapter 3, verse 7 and 8. It's done now. It's done. The image is clearly up. Because now, he repeats it. Another influencing idea of how do I know it was a groundbreaking foreshadow and then it wasn't done yet? Because verse 7 then says that the appointed, in other words, well, now it's time. Then they heard the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all the people and nations and languages all fell down and worshipped. Right? Verse 7 is telling you what was going to happen earlier, as they stated, is now for the first time happening. So verse 7 is the first time that anybody had the opportunity or the obligation to worship this image. The other 6 verses were all preparatory. It's telling you what the king did 16 years later after what happened in chapter 2. I just talked about that. Why he was doing that, what he built. Took him 3 to 12 months to do all this. He's dedicating this groundbreaking ceremony, giving the rules of engagement when it's all done, what's expected of you. Then in chapter 3, verse 7, wham! Now, it's done, it's finished. Now comes the first shout out. What say you? And he's telling you that in chapter 3, verse 7. This is the first time now the project is done. You know the rules. You all had 3 to 6 months while I was doing the project to go out and tell all your yahoos that you're overseeing what the rules are. They come to the valley of Dura. You know what I said. It's your head on the line. You better make sure they do what they got to do. And I expect you to put them in the fire right away. And all of a sudden now, he goes to verse 8. And then wherefore at that time, so during this the first time the cry went out, the first test, the first time to worship, all of a sudden, these Chaldeans, which I'm going to call wackadoodles, the same yahoos in chapter 2 who appealed to his ego, who deflected and denied, well, we talked to gods, but we don't know your dream. Well, then you're a liar. Only the gods would know. Well, I thought you said you talked to the gods, so why don't you know? These people are hypocrites. They talk about both sides of their mouth. These guys are like the quintessential politicians. These Chaldeans are disgusting, depraved, wicked, ignorant, self-imputed wise into their own rights people. So that's who these Chaldeans are. And they come, we already know, they spoke to him in Syriac, which is Aramaic, which means they were there for the longest period of time. They were from the Assyrian ilk when he conquered them. So they've been in his cabinet the longest. They act like, they got this bag of chips, like, chip on their shoulder. Like, oh, I'm going to lead the way. I set the tone. I got the longest tenure here. I got seniority. Yeah, you got seniority in being ignorant, that's for sure. You got seniority in being arrogant, ignorant, fleshy, carnal, and just off the rails. I'll give you that. But they come to the king with this attitude, with this posturing, and it says they accused the Jews. And the exegesis says they chewed them out. Why does it say that? Because in the actual Hebrew word, the word accused means maliciously accused. Something like this. King, you ain't going to believe this. The people that you put over your affairs, Not only are they not falling down and worshiping, they're doing nothing to encourage and enforce anyone to do likewise. How dare they? How could they? After all you've done for them, King, 16 years, King, you have blessed them with the position over our affairs of the work of the service. And now they can't do this one thing? They despise you. They don't want to honor you. They disobey you. And they're telling others to do likewise by their silence, by their insolence. What are you going to do about it, King? That's kind of something like that. It's what they were doing. It wasn't like, can you believe this? It was I was walking along the way and I saw these guys. No. It was very vehemently. It reminds me a lot of like when Jesus was being tried unjustly at midnight unto the a.m. morning hours by the Sanhedrin, these wackadoodle folks who are breaking the law of Moses left and right, how they accused him falsely in these mock jeer trials, what they did to him. It reminds me of that. Like, and they took a break. Don't forget, at Easter, about 2 a.m. in the morning, took a break to honor Passover. In the midst of disobeying with hate and bitterness and malice and anger and arrogance in their heart, took a break to go, I'm going to honor God now. God's going to honor that. Brr. It reminds me of the same attitude these Chaldeans have. They act like, the king's going to honor me because I'm upholding his law. It's all they care about, how they're viewed in the eyes of man. It's all they care about. And the one man they care about, the king. It's all they care about. Find favor with him at any cost, any means. So they do this with the Hebrew children. And he spoke, and they, by the way, after they chew him out, they use the same exact flattery ego issue they used back in chapter 2, verse 4. O king, live forever. I can just hear their arrogant, pious. It reminds me of people that they exploit. And there's people that they exploit other people. They call them useful idiots. When you use people to just represent something that they don't understand, and they're doing your bidding ignorantly, arrogantly. These people are like, "O king, live forever." Oh, please, stop with your, it's such a pious, empty, hollow, it resonates nothing. They don't mean, they're just trying to, all they mean is, we're appealing to you to get what we want, which is I want these people dead. I can't stand these three yahoos. Daniel, I can't touch him because he's over us. But these guys, they're kind of different positions in the cabinet. We're of the cabinet, they're under us, but yet they have stations up in positions with you, and we want you to just, we can't stay. They already upstaged us the first 3 years of the tutoring. Then you honored them after the Daniel experience with the dream, and for the last 16 years we had to endure these twofold things, that they come from a place that we were here before them, and they were usurped above us. And on top of that, now they're going to not do this. They are jealous, they are envious, they are filled with hate and animus and bitterness, and they have an axe to grind. And they found an opportunity to act, and they just jumped on it. This tells me that during tribulation period, the last half, when the mark of the beast is instilled, there's going to be some, as my black friends call, Uncle Toms out there. There's going to be some folks in Christianity that took the mark of the beast and know others that don't, and they're going to call them out. Because they're so filled with their own selfish mindset, they're not going to understand. That's not good, dude, what you're doing. This is what the Chaldeans, they were maliciously, which means from a bad place of evil and sin. Not from a sense of, I'm upholding the king's law. They were doing it from a selfish, wicked, malicious, jealousy, envy, bitterness, spite standpoint. Clearly. Just like people in tribulation, other people in Christ will rat other people out, like Uncle Tom's, ratting them out for not taking the mark of the beast. Can you imagine that? It's unbelievable. How would you do such a thing? It's so crazy. So when it says Chaldeans, are we to think these were these are the wise men of the king's council? That's correct. And that's why they're appealing to the fact that, hey, we were like them, but look, we're wise enough to hear and know and do what you said to do. They're not. So what's up with that? And you put them over the works of the service, or the affairs, so what's up? Right? So they appear to the king in verse 8. And of course they do it the whole flattery. Oh, king, live forever. I hate this. I want to punch him in the face. So in verse 10, or verse 9, excuse me, they say that in verse 9, the king live forever. Then in verse 10, then, O king, thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man should hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the cymbal, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music. And he says, And then they shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falls not down and worship, this should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And there are certain Jews. See, he didn't say there are certain men in your kingdom. He didn't say there are fellow wise men in your chamber that you've exalted over the affairs. No. Where's their animus at? That they're Jews. That they're Hebrews. They're certain Jews. Why does that matter? Why are you pointing out they're Jews? Why does it matter what they are? Animus much? Bigotry much? Discrimination much? All they're doing is showing their hand of bigotry, discrimination, bias, hate, envy. That's all this is. This is all hateful. They're just jealous of how God of Israel is shown on them and not on them. And they were embarrassed by the king. And by the way, don't forget, their lives were spared because of them. Don't think that's lost on them. They're like, oh my gosh, some of my fellow Chaldeans and astrologers and magicians and sorcerers and soothsayers are dead, and those of us who are alive, we owe them thanks. But 16 years later, what do? They resent it. They resent the fact that this Jew saved my life. God used this Jew to restore the king's hand from not killing us. Because that's what happened. They don't like it. Isn't that crazy? Instead of just saying thank you, they're filled with resentment and anger and hate and bitterness. It's so ignorant. Look how fleshy you got to be to not see God's hand. No matter how he uses it, no matter who he works through, why don't you just say thank you? Who cares if God works through an evil human being? We saw in Daniel's case, it doesn't matter what evil's done unto you. It's how you respond to it that matters. It doesn't matter who's wrong. You're wrong when you don't respond correctly. Period. No commentary section. Not a he said, she said, they said, I said. No. Do what God tells you to do. We talked about it before. Jesus never said, love those that hate you as long as your personality type extroverted. He didn't say that. He didn't say, bless those that curse you, only if you're the personality trait that allows you to have that ability to do that. He didn't say that. So stop your lies and your posturings and excuses. Well, I can't do that. Well, I don't know how to do that. I'm not an emotional person. I don't like conflict. I don't talk. I don't care. Neither does Jesus. He doesn't care about your excuses. He wants your obedience. Get that through your head. The challenge is, because of our personality traits, it's different for each of us depending on what situation it may be. It's easier for an introverted person to be a peacemaker because they don't get in trouble by saying things they shouldn't say. Right? It's easy for them. They don't like confrontation, so they're more amiable to bring about peace. But it's harder for someone who's extroverted. Well, the opposite is true. It's easier for an extrovert to stand up and to unrighteousness. It's harder for an introverted person. It doesn't matter what your personality trait is. Jesus already knows that. He's wanting you to know, stop using that as an excuse, rise up above the natural inclination of whatever your disposition is, and do what he told you to do. Stop making excuses. Stop it. Here's the Chaldeans making excuses, because here's the question I would ask them. You're alive because of them stopping the king's decree, right, of killing everybody? Yes. We're 16 years later, and you know the last 16 years you breathed the clean air because of these Jews. You know that, right? Yes. So why are you mad at them? Why can't you just say thanks? Well, because what happened? Why? Why is that? Because you hate them. You despise them. You're a bigot against them. You can't get past who they are to realize you wouldn't even be alive if it wasn't for God using them. You do realize this, right? Don't tell me they don't know this. Yes, they do. It's how much their hate has overridden their common sense. Isn't that insane? What does that say about us? That as human beings, we're so filled with resentment and bitterness and hate and malice, like when our parents treat us unjustly, right? But wait a minute. I wouldn't be in this world unless God used that egg and that sperm of that mom and that dad to bring me about. Hence the commandment, honor mother and father. Doesn't matter how they live their lives toward me. It does matter, but it doesn't matter to my responsibility to honor their position God gave them over me. Period. Period. I wouldn't be alive unless God chose that sperm, that egg. Therefore, he chose that for a reason. No comment section about only if they live righteously, honor your mother and father. It didn't say that. So this goes back to Principles 101 of practical takeaways of the book of Daniel. It's filled with them, man. With these young men. Now at 32 years old, now they're men. So in verse 11 of chapter 3, he said, they didn't fall down. Whoever would not fall down and worship should be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. In verse 12 of chapter 3, there are certain Jews whom you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Why are they bringing that up? They're bringing up two things. They're the Jews. They're not like us. They're monotheistic. Remember? We're the polytheist ones, appealing to Nebuchadnezzar's roots. You know the old adage, a politician goes back to their roots? They want Nebuchadnezzar to go back to his roots, because Egypt did that. When a Pharaoh that rose up didn't know Joseph, they went back to their roots of polytheism. They were monotheistic for a while under Joseph's influence. People in Egypt were, and the Israelites' influence over them. Nebuchadnezzar was a monotheistic believer for a while, and he got back to his roots of polytheism, and they already saw that with the image, so now they're appealing to the fact that, hey, by the way, let's get back to your roots of who you are as a king. Remember? Not only are they not like us, they're not from the east, like we are. Syria and Babylon from the east. These are Judea people. Oh, by the way, they're Jewish. Oh, by the way, you put them in, look how they show you their thanks to you as you exalted them to a place of overseeing things. And what they're going to do to you? They're appealing to his ego, to his authority that they're going against. They're trying to really stack a deck against these people, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They want the king to throw down the heavy hammer quick and hard. But what's, he says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these mighty men, or these men of God, O king, have not regarded. This is where you know the idea is, and the word not regarded is, they didn't set your command. So this idea of set your command, or point your, which means that they didn't do it, nor did they enforce or encourage others. That's how I know that statement earlier I made is true. They didn't do it, nor did they enforce or encourage others. Think about it. How could they? How could they? They can't do that. You can't tell me an officer of the law, you can't say, you have to take this woman to get an abortion. No, I don't. No, I do not have to do that. You have to give her safe pass. No, I do not. No, I do not. That's not in my job description. That's a lie. I do not have to facilitate something that it's a murder. I don't have to do that just because you think it's a rite of passage they have. No, it does not. No. That's not my right to do that. You don't have to tell me. You can't do that. So here's them saying, they're saying to the Chaldeans, to the king, they didn't set a time, they didn't appoint themselves to kneel and worship, nor did they encourage or enforce others to do likewise. And they're people that you count on for the works of service to do your very bidding, and they're not doing it. They're not doing it, they're not enforcing, encouraging others to do it. But they're pointing out in verse 12. That's the idea of the magnitude, of the import of that phrasing when it says, they have not regarded you, or set aside, no taste you. They serve not the other God. Here it goes. They serve not the gods, nor worship the golden image. See, it's two different things. They didn't serve or worship. Which you raised up, king. And what's the king's response to this? They got what they wanted. He is livid. Verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar has enraged and furious. And it means he had a violent anger and he's filled with wrath. Sounds familiar back in chapter 2. We read about this in chapter 2, verse 12, when the king got mad at the Chaldeans for the third time answering his question. It says the king was angry. He was indignant and furious. That's in chapter 2, verse 12, indignant and furious. And God diffused that. This time it says he was violently angry. So indignant and furious is more an internal, like blowing up. Violent anger and wrath means he actually hit something. He actually did something to act out in violence. He probably, I don't know, but I can imagine his king's chamber and something's next to him. He probably knocked something over or threw something. He did something as an act of violence. And violence, I don't care what our current political environment is, they're filled with lies. Words are violence. No, they're not, you moron. Violence is violence. And violence takes actions, not words. And he used violent anger, which means he acted in violence. He did something. I think he knocked over something, he threw something, but they knew, oh, dang, he's tired. Right? Not tired, he's angry, he's upset. How did these Chaldeans get their name? Was there an actual land called Chaldee? Yeah, Ur of the Chaldees. Ur of the Chaldees. That's where Abram came from, Ur of the Chaldees. It's from this area in the Babylonian Assyrian region. It was called the Chaldean region. So anybody who was of the Assyrian Chaldean, everybody who's Chaldean is either Assyrian or Babylonian. That's the whole area. Ur of the Chaldees is where Abram was from. And the Chaldeans were polytheistic. Abram was a polytheist before God called him to be monotheistic. Yeah, the whole Chaldean region was where later on became modern day Assyria, in their day became Assyria and Babylon. But the Chaldean region was of that region where Abraham was from, in that area which was known as Babylon. So, yes. So when you get to this place where now you have them saying, well, they didn't serve or worship, the king gets violently angry and filled with wrath. Here's the difference. With the Chaldeans, earlier in chapter 2, he got indignant and filled with wrath. He didn't act anything out in violence because he was just upset because they did come when they were called. They did answer him, but they didn't answer him with what he's asking them, and he repeated himself 3 times. Chapter 2. And because they 3 times fell short, he got indignant and full of wrath. This time, it's not just how they're disobeying him. He got violently angry, I would contend to you, because not just because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, it's because they were disobeying a direct command. They weren't not answering what he said. They were disobeying a direct command, and it set a tone that others were also doing likewise. So the lack of, because this is a one-on-one sin earlier in chapter 2, the Chaldeans weren't, they were offending him. They were upsetting him with the indignance and wrath directly. Whereas here, they're upsetting him directly because of indirectly they were causing others to usurp the king's authority and disobey his decree because they didn't fall down in worship, and they're put in a position of status to lead by example, and they're not encouraging and enforcing others to do likewise. That's a whole different level of getting upset. So it's like, okay, you're not obeying me versus not obeying me and you're misleading my students, right? That's different. Now you're sowing discord in my kingdom. You're sowing disobedience. Oh, he was livid. That's why he's more upset here. That's why it says violently angry. Versus chapter 2 and verse 12, he was just indignant and filled with wrath because, yeah, he doesn't like any time someone doesn't do what they're asked and goes against what he's directly holding them into account for. He doesn't like that. But it's different now because they're affecting other people and they're given a position that it's clearly being seen by everybody that they're going against his decree. How dare they? How dare they openly mock him? The Chaldeans were in his court doing this. They weren't openly in the square questioning the king, saying, we don't know. No, they were doing this as one-on-one time. This is different. So that's why the king is a little more upset. It's more of a public display of disobedience. He didn't like that. It set a tone throughout his kingdom. I can't have people that I appoint over others not doing what I say. I can't have that. I can't have that. So he gets upset, and he commanded to bring them, and they brought these men before the king. So here's my question. Why? Why bring them before you, king? You just got finished saying earlier in chapter 3 and verse 7 and 8 that there ain't no time for playtime. You don't fall down and worship. You get burned alive in that very moment. Why are you bringing them before you? Why the conversation? Why the need to vet this out? Why? Why? I'm asking for a friend. Why? It just goes again to show you that in the back of his mind, there's God influencing him once again. And the Chaldeans are probably thinking, yeah, why? Why are they not being thrown into the fiery furnace? Because they even said so when they accused him before the king. They said, this is what's supposed to happen. What does the king do? The opposite. Just have them come before me. What? What about just going in the fiery furnace like you said? I thought that was your decree said that's the consequence. Why bring him before you have a conversation? Why? Because God once again got a hold of Nebuchadnezzar. Again. It's amazing. So in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said unto them, is it true? And the word is it true is tisadah. Is it your intention? In other words, they may have observed this, but is there some other possible rational explanation you could give me? This is an interesting Hebrew phrase here when he says, is it certain? Is it true? Is it your intent? He's trying to find any way possible to explain how this could be true, which tells me a lot about how he views them. He does not view them as believing that that is a true story, that they would willfully, knowingly want to make him angry, want to disparage him, want to disobey him. It's not like them. After what he saw from the God of Daniel, which is also their God, 16 years earlier, it's hard for him to reconcile this. He doesn't understand that they helped me before. They're Daniel's friends, and he asked me to exalt them to a different position of overseeing things, and I did that. And it doesn't fit the mold of their character that they would willfully just want to upset me. It wasn't about upsetting him. It was about not upsetting God. But he was taking it personal. This is what my mom did one time. Remember when I left the Catholic understanding of things and went to be a believer in Christ, she took it personal and she said, I can't believe that you are dishonoring your mother because you're saying you weren't baptized when I did that when you were a baby. I said, no. This has nothing to do with what you did, whatever you thought was what was right, and I'm not going to speak to that. I'm just telling you that I was not baptized until just now. And then she said again, you're dishonoring your mother. That's what you're doing when you say that. Okay. And she said you're dishonoring your mother and father when you say you now believe in Christ alone without the traditions of the Catholic Church. That's dishonor. She couldn't separate the Catholic tradition with mom and dad. She thought honoring mother and father meant to agree with, to subordinate yourself with everything they say is true about who God is. This is Nebuchadnezzar's problem. He's trying to figure out how do they personally. That's not them. They're not in it to just irritate me, to put a stick in my cage and get in my craw. That's not their personality trait. That's not their character. But that's what's happening. So, but how could they? He doesn't understand that Nebuchadnezzar. They have one true God, and you're telling them to serve and worship other gods. They can't do that. But part of your ignorance doesn't understand that. But he's too ignorant to see the truth right in front of his face. He knows the truth. He's just in denial of his own. He's so consumed his own thoughts. But one thing is true: his own thoughts still that told him this doesn't gel. Their character versus this action. I don't get it. So he wants to get understanding of it. Is it true in verse 14? Is it your intent? Do not you serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Then in verse 15, now if you be ready or prepared, that means now he's just giving them a shot across the bow to say, I want you to either double down on what the accusation is, or I want you to recant and do what you're supposed to do in verse 15. Are you prepared that at the time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship to the image I have made? Well, but if you do not worship, and you should be cast in that same instant into the midst of the burning fire. And then in verse 15, he shows you where he's at. You can see there's something, when he made that comment to them, in verse 15, now if you be prepared, you can just see the look on their face was a look of defiance, a look of civil disobedience to say, I respect the authorities over me, but only to the extent it doesn't usurp upon God or his word. You can't ask me to break character, what God asked me to be and do, and I can't violate his word. Those are two things I can't. Everything else, King, I will subordinate myself to you as an authority over me, but I will not break from God's character of who he is, and I will not violate his word. Can't do it, won't do it. That look on their face of defiance was clear. And that's why he said what he said. One more time. He does the opposite of what he said was supposed to happen. He's supposed to immediately go to the fire. He's having a conversation with them, asking them a question. Is that your intent? Then he said, now you're prepared. He said a second time, I'm going to have the music play. He's giving them another chance. Well, you can see that he is wanting not to do this. But he also doesn't want to be upstaged by some servants in his kingdom. That ain't going to happen. Right? So he makes it very clear in front of everybody, do it now because I'm not going to be embarrassed. What I say goes around here. I'm trying to reason with you here. That's his worldly, carnal mindset. Like, I can't believe that they're going to do that to me. I can't believe they can't even do this one thing for me. That's his fleshy, man-made mindset, which is what people do to us, right? People in Christ. I can't believe that you wouldn't go to the Mormon temple with me. I cannot believe you wouldn't go to Kingdom Hall. You're my friend, man. You're my friend. You were there with me. I saved you that time when you were off the cliff and you were upside down and your car was on fire and I pulled you out. And you can't go to my wedding because I'm marrying a man. You can't go to. No, I can't, dude. Doesn't matter what you did for me, who you are to me. There's the character of God, and the violation of his word, I cannot cross. How do you not know this? Come on, don't ask me to do something you know I can't do. And don't hold it against me as if I don't care about you or don't appreciate and respect you for what you have done and who you are over me in God's will. Don't do that. But people do it all the time. My mom did it. Friends do it. Loved ones do it. They usurp and use their positional status or their influence in your life to try to justify some way that you're the wrongdoer for upholding God's character and his word, that you're filled with hate, that you're filled with disobedience, that you're the one who's insolent, that you're the one who's incredulously arrogant and biased against the truth, and you're denial and rebellion against God. That's the problem here. Nebuchadnezzar. That's the problem here. But he doesn't see that. Right? So here you go into this place where he says to them in verse 15, the latter part of it, now he is mocking God, and he's flaunting his authority over them when he says, and who is that God that's to deliver you out of my hands? He's reminding them. Remember, your friend Daniel told you that I was the king of all kings. Remember back in chapter 2 and verse 37? I'm the king of all kings, so the God of heaven has given me the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. So he's acting like, who is this God? Remember who I am from 16 years ago? Who your friend Daniel declared your God said who I was? Do you not know? Do you not shut up? Do you not want to obey? They're like, oh, bore me the details. No. Who cares what you're saying? All your pompousness and piety and posturing is not going to scare us into worshiping and serving other gods. Not going to happen. So keep on with your epithets and your rage and all your pontification. It's not going to work, okay? Do you see us shuddering? Do you see us wavering? Do you see the look on our face? We're in this for the long haul. We're not stopping and deviating now. And he knew that. This is his last-ditch statement of like, do you know who I am? Like Pilate. Do you not have the authority over you? Jesus goes, no, you don't. God gave you authority over you. Only authority you have over me is what's given you by heaven. This reminds me of that. This pompous arrogance of man to think he has authority over you. No, you don't. No, you don't. I don't care what it looks like in time. Ultimately, it's God who gave you that authority for a time, for a purpose. God's the ultimate authority over each one of us. To our white supremacist, ignorant people, every time you see the word master in the Bible, it never refers to a man. It's referring to God and how we are all his slaves. He never intended for a man to impute the word master to himself. Even though people did this, doesn't mean that wasn't God's intention. And it's certainly not what he's talking about in the Bible. Whenever he uses these stories of master and slaves, he's the master. It's always him. Always, 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 always him. And we are the slave. So let's get that through our heads, right? So we don't want to hear this because that's just the way people are. They're just boneheaded. So in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, of course, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, answered and said to the king of Nebuchadnezzar, I love this. I love this. We are not careful to answer to you in this matter. What that means is, and paraphrasing Hebrew verbiage, what they're basically saying is, we're not wavering. We're full with conviction. This is a no-go for us. This is a deal killer for us. We will submit and do what you say up until this. We will not serve other gods. We will not worship an image. Do your worst. We're not changing our position. We're not wavering from our position. We're staying right here. It's like Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, when he's at the Council of Worms, he stood up and said, even the demons themselves appear and say to me, recant that it's by grace through faith alone. I will not, and I cannot, and I never will. And the Catholics hated him for it. He's like, so what? Bring it on, baby. Martin Luther's like, who cares? I don't care if demons themselves manifest in front of me to scare the bejeebies out of me. He's saying, I'm not going to change my mind. It's by grace through faith. And here you have these Hebrew children saying this to Nebuchadnezzar. In their day, this is a pretty big deal. People say, oh my gosh, I could do that. Could you though? We're not talking about set up to the guy in the back alleyway who could beat you up, or the guy with the gun, or the guy with the knife, or the policeman. We're talking about the Supreme Court, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief a person who's a judicial federal courtroom who has the ability to lock you up for life and or including the death penalty. And they're asking you to do something to avoid that, and you refuse. You could do that. Don't lie. That is a very hard ask. God's asking a lot of them. He's asking a lot. It sounds easy on the outside. Oh, I wouldn't serve other gods. I wouldn't worship other gods. Okay, I understand that. But given the peer pressure that the entire kingdom is kowtowing to him, and he's now angry. The last time he was angry, what would happen? He made a decree to kill people. This time, his decree was, you don't serve and worship my other gods, immediately in the fire. Now he has a conversation with them, tries to reason with them, and he gets angry again and tries to diffuse it by reasoning with them. And now he says, one more time, this is it. Do you not know? No one can take you out of my hand. You're in my hands now. Your fate's in my hands. Your butt belongs to me. And they're like, no, it doesn't. I don't care what you say. And he's just like, and that's why they're just full of conviction in verse 16. Like, no, it doesn't. No, we don't. We're not in your hands. They're just full of conviction. We're not changing our mind. Then in verse 17, I love it. If it be so, this is great. I love when folks say, don't say that negative thing. Don't put it out there into the universe. Oh my goodness gracious. Don't say that. Don't say it. Don't say it. They said it. But you don't read? Daniel 3:17. If it be so. In other words, if we die, we die. Who cares? Any person dies. As Martin Luther King used to say, not everybody lives. And he used to say, if you're not prepared to die, then you're never ready yet to live. And Hananiah and Mishael and Azaziah were like, oh, I'm ready to die, baby, because I live for an upright living God. I don't care what happens to me. You cannot take from me who he is, and I will not serve, and I will not worship. It doesn't matter what you do to me. You can't force me to do that. You can kill me, you can torture me, you can kill me, you can hate me. Fine. I control who I serve. I control who I worship because God gave me the ability to choose that. He gave me the right to know who he is. I will not defy him. I will not disparage him. I will not dishonor him. I will not devalue him. And I certainly won't rebel against him. So do your worst. You can take my body. You can't take my soul. These three Hebrew children, now 16 years later, now they're 32 years old, you can see the kahunas on them have grown quite a bit. They are completely convicted, completely rooted in their faith. There's not one iota of fear. There's not one speck of doubt. They are filled with conviction and truth and uprightness of what they know is right. They could care less. Whatever you say, whatever you're going to do, it's not going to change how I think and what I say and what I do. Do your worst. But wow, like what an example, right? What an example. Were they taught by Melchizedek? I don't know about that. No. From where or how did these three and even Daniel get such a strong conviction? I'm sure they were humble and they respond. Well, they get their conviction. This goes back to what I was saying in chapter 1. It was a gift from God. To answer your question, Sister Vicky, it was a gift from God. It was a gift from God to make them feel, because remember there was other Hebrew children. Chapter 1, verse 6. It was them and only those four who were gifted by God. And of those four, only Daniel was given the gift of interpreting visions and dreams. It was God's gift. They didn't do anything. No one taught. God just gave. God imputed that to them. I don't know what to tell you. It's amazing. I asked the same question. How did they get this? It's just the only answer we have is, but God. God did it. How did Paul get the higher wisdom of God's word over the other apostles that walked with him for 3 years? Why was Paul the one given the sacrament of the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians 11 to tell us about it when he wasn't even there? Why? God. Because, but God, right? Why was John the one of all the 12 who was given the ability to watch after Mary and the one who was not murdered even though they tried? Why was he the only one to live a long life? Why did he see Revelation? Why did he know about the names of the city before he died? The rest of them didn't know the names on the etched on the holy city. They didn't know that. So I hear you. I don't know why God does what he does, but I get what you're saying. But my answer is, but God allows that. But God ordains that. But God just does what he wants to do. To do the very thing of just saying, you know what? It's not about mankind. It's about what he wants and what he wills and what he provides and what he sovereignly ordains. And he sovereignly ordained to have 4 13-year-old young men make an indelible mark on history and on the kingdom of men, and forever and ever on all of us in Christ. And those of the covenant people should reference and know this story and know these young men. And we can all learn such a valuable lesson from how they grew and they germinated and they cultivated and developed this relationship with God, and it made them such demonstrative examples of love and faith and wisdom and trustworthiness. And they were just so filled with conviction. It is such a demonstrative example of like how to live out your faith and the face and the shape of any tyranny, any conflict, any whatever's against you. And therefore you can never think about it. If anybody could have said he said, she said, it's them. They could have said, well, the Chaldeans said that they're just mad because we're Jews. They didn't even mention that. They didn't care. Well, they're just mad because we're the ones that despise, and if it wasn't for us, through our friend Daniel, they'd be dead. They're just always, since then, they resent the fact that it was us who was God used to save their life. They didn't say that. They could have said he said, she said, didn't they? They could have easily used so many things to bring up to the king against they ignored the accusation. They could care less. They kept in the pocket of the conversation. It's about us and God, and we will not do what you say when it's against God and our obligation to obey him. They kept on point in the conversation. Everything that we don't do, we get caught up in, well, he made me feel like this. Well, she said that. Well, then they did this. It doesn't matter. It's so dumb. We're so dumb like sheep. And there's these 32-year-old these men are saying, do what we did. Stay in the pocket of who you are in Christ. What he wants from you. Stay in that mindset. Stay in the mindset. Stop giving into the emotions and the mental frame and what he said, she said, they did, she did, I did. Who cares? Stop it. Stay in the point of who you are, what God expects from you, and what you're supposed to say and do in the moment. Stay in that. When it comes to conflict and pressure and tenuous situations and how I'm supposed to respond and how do I do the right godly thing, stay in that mindset. You will do right. You'll do well. These 32-year-old young men, they were teaching us this. It's so much to learn. God, please help me with this. I suck at this. I wish I could do better at this. I wish I could do better at this. Sometimes okay, sometimes not good, sometimes nah. But not like this. Not like this. It's unbelievable. So in verse 17, like, yeah, whatever, man. They're like, hey, if we die, we die. If it be so, in verse 17, God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. He'll deliver us out of your hand, O king. And what's it? But if not, so much for those who go, you shouldn't say that because God said you shouldn't put negative things in the universe. That's a lie. He didn't say that. Your moron, dumb preacher on the TV radio said that. Here's 3 Hebrew children saying clearly, if he makes us die, we die. If we live, we live. It doesn't matter. Get that through your head. My words can't change reality, you bonehead. My conviction is who I am in God, and I'm going to trust in his character and his word, and I'm not going to violate it. Period. Whatever happens after that, happens. I can live with that. That's what they're saying. There's nothing they can say that's going to change the reality. Their conviction's their conviction. And I said in verse 18, if he doesn't do it, be it known to you, O king. Either way, they're saying, be it known to you. I don't care if we live or die. We're never going to serve or worship other gods. Are we clear? Goodness gracious. Their resolve is like tenacious, man. They're like, doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. The normal lifestyle surrounding were removed, and all they had was each other. Yeah, they were removed from the normal lives. I'd like to meet their parents. They're no kidding, right? 13 years old, like to meet their parents. Let's go back to what Sister Vicky said. Did their parents have an influence on them, and were their parents godly? I don't know. Remember, because Josephus says that Daniel probably came from the Zedekiah line of some ilk of his family lineage. All we know is they are the sons of Judah. We know that. They're from the tribe of Judah. We don't know who their parents are. We just know that they're from that tribe, which is the tribe of kings. So one would think you have a kingly line among other Hebrew children who weren't from the tribe of Judah, that you had better upbringing maybe. I don't know. I would love to know who their parents were, like you said. Yeah, in heaven, I went, hey, Dan, who are your parents? I'd love to, and same with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Did your parents have an influence on you, or was it just like at 13 years of age when you're in Babylon, all of a sudden this just came out of nowhere? Or was it always like, was it germinating earlier on in your walk of faith with God that you sense God working through your parents, through your uncle, through your aunt, through your brother, through your sister? Was there something going on there that we don't know about? I don't know. But God doesn't tell us. He wants the emphasis to be on him, that's why. Right? And so here you go to verse 18. And they said, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't matter. We're not going to serve. We're not going to worship what you have set up. I love it. They're saying it doesn't. There's nothing you can say or do that can change their mind. So continue to pontificate, continue to threaten, continue to posture, continue to peacock. It doesn't matter. He's getting ticked off. Nebuchadnezzar's like, you imagine 32-year-old men before a king who is probably in his 50s, 60s at this point, looking at them like, do you know who you're talking to? He's like, oh yeah, we know who I'm talking to. We know who you are. A man made by God, who we serve and will not deviate and rebel against. What else you got? I have no. Yeah. You ain't got nothing on us. They're just like, man. These young men, they are mirroring the character and the tenacity and the godliness of Daniel in the previous chapter. It took them 16 years later to get it, but they're there. They're there. They've arrived. They are there, Jack. Then you see in verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar, he reacts, and he's cool. No, filled with fury. Now he's overflowing. Because he's trying to save their life through reason, to not obeying his own decree by the immediacy in the fiery furnace. He's trying to say, okay, now when I do the music, now would you bow down? And what's he get in return? They're doubling and tripling down on not going to happen, not going to do it. If God does it, he does it. If he doesn't, he doesn't. As far as sparing our lives, we don't care if we live or die. That's not the point. Our lives aren't what we fear. We fear the living God of not serving him and doing what he says. That's what we fear. We don't fear you being upset with us or you wanting to beat us or kill us. That doesn't make us afraid. What makes us afraid is letting down God. Devaluing and defacing and demoralizing, turning our back on our God. That's what makes us fearful. And that's not going to happen. Not you or any other man going to make us do that. And he's just filled with fury, like, how does my influence, how does my power, how does my, remember that? Verse 238, how does my power, strength, and glory of the King of Kings of all men, how do I not intimidate you? How do I not lord over you and influence you to do what I say? They're like, because you're a man? Because you're a man. Because you're a created thing. You can't compare the created thing of finiteness to the infinite wonder and awesomeness of an almighty God. Are you out of your mind? And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't get this. He's just filled with himself. He's so feeling himself. Verse 19, he's filled with fury. And watch this now in verse 19. And the form of his face or his visage was changed. His facial expression changed. He went from trying to figure out, are you guys senile? Are you maybe not thinking straight? Have you lost your marbles? Maybe you're not hearing me straight. When they double and triple down on saying, no, we heard you. He gets so furious, it changes his facial. I don't know about you, but I've seen, not to bring up my mother, not to be mean, but I'm telling you that it just really is. My mother would say things to me, it's in my mind forever, and she'd make a wicked face. I don't even want to, it's so mean. It just ripped your soul out of your body. It's just so, what they say, that looks could kill. My mom would do that when she was indignantly, only my siblings can understand what I'm talking about. But it's just look on her face she would give you with such indignance, with such hate, with such demonic presence of just like pure evil. It would just be so like, oh my gosh. It was beyond anger. It was beyond hate. It was just so heinous. I can imagine a face like that Nebuchadnezzar is making at these three Hebrew children, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And this, for me, when I saw that kind of face from my mother, when I was supposed to honor, it just wilted me. It just demoralized me. I didn't respond with retaliatory. I just wilted. I just crushed I just got deflated. And yet, they see this from the king who has the power and authority over them, which God gave them the ability to be under him, and they've been under him for now 18 years. And now they're 16 years post the reality that he had an experience with God, and now they're seeing for the first time his face toward them in such a way where he wants to end them. Where he is just fed up. He is so filled with hate with rage, with malicious intent. He wants to, oh, he's furious. When your face changes with fury, then you're really upset, right? And Brother Lee is a guy who's martial art trained in different black belts, and he came from a background of knowing what we're talking about. I think of all people, they understand when it shows on your face, that's not good. That's not good. It's about to come out on the butt whipping. When you see it on the face, and when I was raised up in that way, when I saw my mom and dad's face, the butt came next. That's where I felt it, and it hurt a lot. So I can just see their sense of, and they don't shudder. Doesn't say, and then the kids shudder. Doesn't say that. And it says, and with this, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said and commanded, and commanded they should be thrown into the furnace. And he said, heat it 7 times more. 7 times more. By the way, later on, he's going to come to the gate of the furnace. To be in front of a fire, I looked this up, you have to be about 15 feet away minimum from a normal house fire or without feeling the heat. This was 7 times hotter. A normal fire, bonfire, house fire, whatever, is about 400 degrees. So if he did this 7 times hotter, that means it's 2,800 degrees guesstimation, roughly. So basically, it's really hot. A lot. Which means later on, when he comes at the gate of the furnace, he's a good 20 feet or more away from that bad boy because it's too hot not to have that maybe embers come out and catch fire and so forth, which is why you saw the soldiers that put him in there, they get consumed. We're going to read that in just a minute. So keep this in mind. He's so filled with rage, he shows it, like I said, when you see it on the face of my mom and dad growing up, next thing I knew, it was going to hurt really bad, more than usual. The buckle's going to be used, additional stuff's going to be used, I'm going to have bloodshed and welts, and I knew I was going to cry a lot and it's going to hurt a lot. I knew it, and I knew it, and I hated it, and I knew it, and I couldn't stop it. And I'm imagining these 3 of your children, and I was scared out of my mind. I'm shaking. I'm crying. There are not any tears. He said 7, their face changes. He said 7 times hotter. They don't know God's going to provide for them. They don't know God's going to be like, I got you guys. They don't know that. God didn't say that. They have no clue. There's no indication. There's no tip of the hat that God's going to hook them up. So don't get this garbage like, oh, well, they knew. No, they didn't. They made it clear in verse 17 and 18, they don't know. Don't forget that. They're saying it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Whether he did or didn't appear in the fire, they were still going in. With the same conviction, with the same tenacity, with the same resolve. Go ahead. Bring it on. Please. They didn't know they were going to win. They didn't know that. They didn't know that. No, they did not. Verse 17 and 18 proves that. They did not know. And they went in nonetheless, filled with tenacity. Unconscionable to understand this. Right? So, 2,800 degrees possibly. Right? 7 times hotter. That proves, why is that important to understand? 7 times hotter. 7 years tribulation. Showing these Thumeticoid types going through the whole 7 years. Showing you the pure fury of the king. Why is that important that the king's furious? To show the Thumeticoid have to undergo the 2 processes of not just the fiery furnace of the 7 years tribulation, but the wrath of the Lamb unleashed on this world. That's why this is a typology of the Thumeticoid. Only they, as faithful ones, have to endure that. No other faithful one class endures that, except for the Thumeticoid who become faithful ones. They and they alone have to endure the reign of the beast as Satan, both ruling, and the wrath of the Lamb unleashed. Brr. Unbelievable. And it shows their mindset with these 3 of your children. They're not caring about their lives. They're not caring and thinking about the fleshy, mental, emotional, physical things around them. All they care about, they're spiritually, they're so locked in spiritually. It's unreal. It's just so, wow. Just, wow. Wow. You don't see them going, just a minute, I got to hang now. No. Let me tie my shoe. You don't, they did it. They don't care. There's no regard for anything. They're just so locked in spiritually. They're so locked in. Verse 20. And he commanded to the most mighty men. That means he had these men of valor that were in the army to bind them. I think these mighty men of valor speak to how the demonic presence in the second half of tribulation is going to be buffeting and usurping and continually trying to make it hard for the people in the second half of tribulation to live and exist, not to mention the soon medical. His mighty men of valor. Okay, all right. Supposed to intimidate me? Mighty men of valor. In other words, he didn't want anybody who's a coward, but he also wanted somebody who was also rough and tough and of the upper ranks to make Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to realize, oh, I'm livid, and I'm making sure that the best of my men shove you in that thing. And he says to bind them. Bind them? What's that about? Just so you know, bind them is the typology of when we're in the second half of tribulation. They're bound. They're under the wrath of the Lamb. They can't change it. Well, God wouldn't endure the bride to the wrath of God. Well, they're not the bride yet, but they are going to become faithful ones. But unfortunately, they're bound to have to go through the whole thing. They can't get out. There's no out. You got to go through the whole thing. You're bound to it. But literally what to speak to? They bound their hands. And like in slavery days, which is where the whole disgusting history of our country and other countries comes from in slavery, they would put a rope around the neck and tie their neck to their necks with their hands tied together. They have a rope from here to their hands and the hand to the next neck. So they were being ushered in like this, like a rope around their neck to their hand to the other person's neck, being ushered in like this. They're bound. That's how they were bound. That's the Babylonian way. That's how they did it. It wasn't the white supremacy racist way. They just copied what was all along the Babylonian Assyrian way. That's how they did it, right? They bound them like this. And by the way, it says shackle, but the thing is, it could be a shackle because it did mention that in Jeremiah that they put Zedekiah in brass fetters or shackles. The problem is that the word later on says that they were unloosed. Then it means to untie or unbind. So could it mean that it came loose? Or could it mean it was string and it unbound? I don't know, but I tell you this. What's interesting is in verse 20, whether it's rope or whether it's actual brass fetters around their arms and around their necks, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If it was brass, by the way, that makes it more ridiculous because that would have obviously brass gets hotter in fire, and that would have left a different burn around their neck and around their arms. Does it not? Get real. The rope is burned off, so it leads you to believe potentially it may have been the brass fetters. So if that's the case, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're cast in the fiery furnace. Verse 21, the mighty men were bound. And now watch this now. With their coats, with their undergarments, with their hats, and with their other robes. And this speaks to the helmet, the loin, the chainmail, and the breastplate, which is part of the armor of God. Because remember, the chainmail is the undergarment below the breast, underneath the breastplate, that is ideally representing those who are the armies of the seasoned soldiers who were known as the Principes, P-R-I-N-C-I-P-E-S, the Principes in the Roman army. They were the seasoned soldiers, and they had the under chainmail underneath their breastplate, which is a sign of those who are deeper, long in the tooth in their faith. This is the undergarments he mentions, or the hosen. The helmet is the hat, the salvation of the soul. The actual loins girded, there's your other garments. And then you have, that's the undergarment, the loins, and the garments are the chainmail. Then the hat and the coats. So you have this breastplate, loins, chainmail, helmet being mentioned, which also, interesting enough, there's more parts of the armor of God than this, but why only 4 mentioned? Which I think speaks of the 4 fruit yields, the 100-fold, the 30, the 60, 100, right? They were the full complement of where they were at. They had fully matured in their faith. And here you have them bound and clothed, and it says that they were cast into the midst of the burning fire. And verse 22, it says, and therefore, because the king's command was urgent. Interesting, because that same urgent is the same thing Daniel said in chapter 2, verse 15. Why the harsh decree? Why the abusive harsh decree? In verse 22, it's letting you know the king's utterance was urgent, meaning he was speaking it like he was just like spitting out of his mouth. He's so vehemently angry. It speaks to the harsh, abusive tone of his command. Cast him in now! Cast him in now! Put him in now! He wasn't like, cast him in. That's not what he was. No. 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 He did not go, continue. Cast him in. No. No. The way verse 22 is worded, the king's utterance was severe. That means he was like spitting with anger. Cast him in! Kill him now! He was livid with fury. The last thing the Hebrew children thought they were going to see was that. Why is that important to know? It's exactly what Satan's going to do in the last half of tribulation, isn't he? The last half, when he is unleashed as the beast, as Satan incarnate, he's going to just be so angry. God's wrath of the Lamb also unleashed on us on the earth, as well as Satan unleashed. It's going to have people just be the last thing you're going to see. To stand for righteousness, stand for what's right, you're going to have to face that. It's not going to be easy. Don't lie to yourself. It'll be easy to live for Jesus. Stop lying to yourself. You have to face the emotional and mental and the whole spiritual trial of abuse that you have to stand in front of. That type of vitriol, that type of animus. Can you do it? Standing for your convictions and standing for and resolve with the sense that they did is one thing, but to do it in front of that visual, symbolic reality by the one who has the authority to do anything he wants, to abuse and take your life, that's quite another thing. That's quite another thing. And that's what's being asked of people who did give their lives in tribulation, the second half. It's being asked of them. To not just do it, oh yes, I will stand in line to give my life for Jesus. Is this the line? Is this the line? Oh yes, Jesus loves me, this I know. No, doofus, that's not how it's going to work. You're going to be in front of demonic presences. You're in front of Satan himself. He's going to adamantly, demonstratively display this hate and animus towards you. And you have to just control your emotions and your mental state and your spiritual conviction and resolution and say, still, I live for God. I'll give my life for Jesus. It's not going to be easy. Don't lie to yourself. Oh, it's going to be easy. No, it ain't. Just so you know. So, not to mention you have the 7 times hotter you're going into as well. Then it says in verse 22, the furnace was exceedingly hot, which was the word for extraordinarily. Extraordinarily. Beyond rational comprehension hot. And the flame of the fire slew the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Meaning, they opened the door, and the flame went, and they just got consumed. The scene is insane. It's so hot. When they opened the door with those little metal things they used to open it up with little metal prongs, they probably, and it caught them. So why did they consume Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Why weren't they consumed? Well, what's with that? You know, that right away was the tip of the hat. Like, did you see that they didn't get hurt? And the mighty men, the strong men, they got just consumed like that. It just killed them instantly. So verse 23, and these 3 mighty men, I think that verse 22 speaks to how Jesus is going to come back in Armageddon and say, do you see how I spare my faithful ones on Mount Zion, but the rest of you that are in front of me, how I pummel you? Yeah, I ain't playing. I will slay you. I always tell people, when Jesus comes back in Armageddon, you want to be behind him, because if you're in front of him, nothing good happens to you. Nothing. Unless you're at the Bema seat, when it's the culmination of that, then we'll see what happens there. But leading up to the Bema seat, when you're in front of him, nothing but bad happens to you. You do not want to be in front of him. And they were in front of the gate, and they got taken out like that. Our God's a consuming fire, it says. This isn't funny. This is God saying, you're done. So in verse 23, certain people can face this fiery, consuming God, and don't worry, others, they don't live to stand. In verse 23, and these mighty men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, in the midst of the fiery furnace. So see the scene? The fire comes out, and they get consumed. And immediately they're walking in, this chain, this possibly bronze fetter around their neck and hand and arms, and then to the next guy's neck. And so they walk in, they fall down to their knees right away. They don't get killed, but they fall down right away, which means what? They saw Jesus, a Christophany, right away. They saw him right away. Well, how do I know? Because they fell down right away. Why are they falling down for him? Because he's in there. He didn't appear later on. He was there all the time. He was there to greet them as soon as they walked into that bad boy. He was right there. He's right there.
They fell down as they were bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar, I love it, the Septuagint says, the King James misses this. The Septuagint says, he heard them singing praises. And verse 24, they were going, oh God is a mighty God who reigns. And he's like, what the? Do I hear songs? Do you see the mockery that God said, oh, mock me, do you? You're going to do songs with music, and then you're going to fall down and worship? I'm going to have them fall down and worship me, and then they're going to sing songs. Because I'm the one that teaches you praise. And then I was like, oh, that's insane. I'm hearing music, I'm hearing song, I'm hearing praise come from the furnace. I'm supposed to hear screeches and yells. No, he's hearing, our God is an awesome God who reigns. They're like, what the? He's like, are you kidding me right now? Where's the screams for help? Where's the agony of pain? Of the skin falling off your flesh, off your bones, your flesh just melting off. Nebuchadnezzar says he was amazed. He was astonished. He was, the word in the Hebrew means he was startled, like he just was looking at it. Like he was so filled with animus. He's like, what was that? He's like, what? I hear a song? Are they singing? Are they singing? What is going on? That's the scene. He's like beside himself. He's just waiting to get their destruction, and the opposite happens. The startledness of it all. I can just see his like, what? Then it says he rose up in alarm, and he spoke and said to his counselors, which are the Chaldeans, that did we not hurl 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? And they answered him and said, truly, meaning without a doubt, there was three people, and they were bound. There was 3, and we bound them by a hand over the neck. We threw them in. We know. We saw it. We was there. We with you, man. And he said, well, behold, in verse 25, I see 4, and they're loose, and they're walking around, and they have no damage. And not to mention, and I hear them singing. Can someone explain to me what's going on? You can see, he's just like, he's beside himself. I love it. It's God's way of saying, yeah, how about that? How about that? How about that? He's like, what? How? How? By the way, same phrasing used that they were not hurt is the same phrasing used later on, Daniel 6, about Daniel in the lion's den, when it says, when Darius came there, and he found that he wasn't injured at all. No hurt, no damage, not one scratch. And it says in verse 25, and not only are they singing, not only are they loosed, not only are they walking, not only are they not damaged, but on top of that, I see a 4th person walking around like the Son of God. Well, wait a minute. He looks like Son of God. Wait a minute. So you're telling me the 4th visage you saw looked differently. So that's why they said like he said like son of one of the gods. They didn't know that was another person. They knew that other visage, that other person they saw was not a human. Because they said, he looks like, the 4th person, the 4th looks like, which means he resembles the Son of the gods. Which means there was something physically about him which speaks to Jesus when he comes back, when he is going to throw down on people. You're going to, well, I wonder who Jesus is on the white horse. I say, how are you going to know from the tribulation white horse or the Antichrist versus him? Because you're going to know with the diadem like circling on his head. There's a bunch of them, plus the big sword, the white horse, and the robe with dipped in blood and the name. You gotta know it's him. And all the horses behind him, all the other faithful ones and mature ones and called ones are going to be behind him going, hey, you're going to know it's him. You're going to know. You'll know. There ain't no regular white horse. There ain't no regular person on the white horse. You're going to know it's him. You're going to know. So here they're like, dude, something ain't right. He don't look like a regular person, right? How would the king know what he looked like? He wouldn't know. That's the whole point. The whole point is he saw something that was abnormal. And this is where I think, personally, Jesus was shining white, glorious, like he did in Mount Transfiguration. He was shining white, glorious to the eye of the person on the outside of the fire. And he saw the other three people in there, but he saw this white glory. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Something about Jesus' appearance was different. I don't know what it was, but it was different enough to know it goes against physics. It goes against normal reactions of the combination of cloth and flesh and fire. You don't have that reaction. That what I just saw is not normal. I think he saw a bright white light. That's what I think. I don't know that. I know one thing. He saw something that was distinctly different than what was normal for that to happen when you burn a person or a thing. You don't see that. He saw something different that it defied science, it defied experience, it defied what he was, that doesn't make any sense. He looked different. And so here he says, Nebuchadnezzar in verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar, as we end up this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth, which is again about 20 feet away, the fiery furnace, and he said, he's shouting out 20 feet away. It's like, he's shouting out, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come forth from the midst of the fire. You servants of the Most High God, come forth, come hither. His whole tone has changed. His whole tone has changed. It's almost like there's a song by George Jones, and he's dead now. He's of a whole group called the Cathedrals. He sung a song about a guy who was an abusive father, and he said, when I went back to the home I was raised in, talked about a father abusing his kid, and he said, well, son, I've been changed. You got a new daddy now. And he said, thanks to Calvary, I don't live there anymore. So it reminds me of this story about Nebuchadnezzar went from being this angry, filled with furious person. He just got changed by God. God just changed his life. He just changed him. He just was overwhelmed with this scene. He's just overwhelmed. All this anger and fury went to, but thanks to God, he just all got, come out, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come hither. He just changed his whole demeanor from this violent, abusive man to this welcoming, come out of the fire. It's an amazing image that God is showing you, that he said, you of the Most High God. And then he said in verse 27, and the princes and the governors and the captains and the king's counselors. Notice there's no judges, no lawyers, no sheriffs, no treasurers, and no rulers. Only 4 of the 8 people were here. Showing you again, it's a difference, but earlier it was a groundbreaking ceremony. They were the extracurricular people of his cabinet. Here, the main cabinet members, which are the princes, the governors, captains, and the counselors. They were here. And they being gathered together, he saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power. That means that they were representing their soulical bodies. Once you get that soulical body, you don't lose it. The fire had no power. And it says, and their hair on their head, not one was singed. It refers to there's no loss of rewards. Not one hair of the body was singed. Not one hair on their head or on their arms. There's nothing. Not even singed. Are you kidding me? There's 2,800 degrees potentially, and not one thing was singed. Your body wasn't hurt, and the coats weren't changed. It means they weren't damaged. Their coats weren't damaged, which means that they had no blemish, no spot. They went through tribulation unstained by the orders and demonic influence and rule of Satan and the beast. Didn't change them whatsoever. Under the worst possible conditions, to Jesus' words in Luke 21, they went through it and smelling like a rose. And the last part, speaking of that, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Meaning, again, they had no negative outcome whatsoever. Nothing mentally, emotionally, nothing spiritually, nothing fazed them, nothing touched them. It speaks to their, again, protective stance that God has on the pseudomedical and typology and tribulation, as it was on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had their sense of soulical body guaranteed. They had no loss of rewards. They kept their garments unspotted, unblemished. And they had no smell of smoke, no negative consequence whatsoever. Nothing of the outside world or Satan's influences and attempts, nothing had an effect on them. Nothing. Not even the smell of it. Then he ends up by saying to you in verse 28 through 30, Nebuchadnezzar, he spoke and he said, blessed be that God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have sent his angel and delivered his servants. Well, in Genesis 48:16, he mentions the angel, and it's referencing clearly a Christophany of Jesus when he says it this way, when Jacob is talking to Joseph about Manasseh and Ephraim. He says in verse 15 and 16, and he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which tended me all my life long to this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. The angel that redeemed, no angel of God, no regular angel redeems you from evil. That's a reference to the angel of the Lord, Jesus himself. That's what he's talking about right here in chapter 3 and verse 28. He sent his angel. This is a Christophany of Jesus, the angel of the Lord. Remember that phrasing, the angel of the Lord is the chief messenger of God, is Jesus himself, God incarnate. And delivered his servants that trusted, which means the ongoingly, it's in this constant tense of trusted in him, and have changed the king's words and yielded their bodies. The word change means he altered. He altered the king's words. When did he do that? When the king saw him, he heard them singing, he saw the fourth man, he saw they weren't damaged. He goes back to the other verse, when you saw that in verse 25, they were loose, they were walking, they weren't hurt, he saw the fourth man, before they heard him singing. All of that changed his furious, angry, violent, insolent, wrathful tone, just abusive, wanting to pummel him on the head. Went from that to this docile, wonderful, come, come, come. He changed. It tells you that. I'm not making that up. Because, oh, you're making that, you're being theatrical. The Bible says that the king was altered in his words. His whole demeanor changed. He went from a vile, violent, filled with fury, anger. I don't know, again, you have to understand, you have to appreciate what this means. Unless you're raised abusive, you don't understand you can't appreciate the full magnitude of it. To go from that level of DEFCON 1 to just like that, to be all docile and welcoming, I'm telling you, that's not normal. It's just not normal. It's just not. And it says he was altered, and they yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship to any God except their own God. In verse 29 and 30, by the way, don't forget, in verse 12 it says, we will not serve or worship your God. In verse 14 they said, they won't serve and worship the God. In verse 18 they said it again, we're not going to serve and worship the God. And what does Nebuchadnezzar say in verse 28? That you will not, that you might not serve nor worship any other God except your own God. He finally it took him 3 times to learn the lesson. They told him 3 times, ain't gonna do it. Then he finally gives in to the statement and says, you're not going to worship any other, serve or worship any other God but your own. And in verse 29, therefore I set a decree that every person, every nation, every tongue, language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is again Hananiah, Mishael, Azaziah, shall be cut into pieces, and their houses made a dunghill. The same thing he said about the wise men in his council 16 years earlier, when they were given the Yahoo runaround, the Chaldeans. That was his decree with fury and anger to dismember them and then burn their houses on fire. So 16 years later, he says the same thing again about anybody speaking against the God of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. He's like, wow. Then in verse 29, he ends by saying, because there is no other God who can rescue, who can deliver after this sort, which means it's a way in Hebrew, but in English, the best way to say it, I've never seen anything like this. There's nothing like this I've ever seen before. This goes beyond comprehension and understanding and plausible explanations. You don't understand what I just saw and witnessed. It is beyond explanation. It defies anything and everything we know that must be of God himself. That's what he's saying. So he's saying it this time, not because of both times now, Nebuchadnezzar is responding to God because of what he sees in a sign and wonder. He saw Daniel tell him a dream that he forgot himself and tell him what it meant. And it also made him feel good about himself. So much so, 16 years later, he got filled with himself. He's filling himself in an image. Lost himself in what God originally taught him. Now God taught him again to another sign and a wonder. And he also acclimates to that sign and wonder like he did the first time. The only way you can know this is God must have told you. Now he's saying the only way I can explain that your God must be the only God there is, because what I just saw it defies belief. It defies anything I've ever seen before. There's no other sort like this who could deliver like what I just saw was ridiculous, what I just witnessed. Then in verse 30, the king promoted, which means he blessed in addition to what they already had, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the province. So it means they weren't just over the affairs and works. The word promoted means he prospered them. It's the same phrasing. If you go back to in Daniel 6:28, it's also used. We're going to go there in the future after he's restored from the lion's den. So Daniel also prospered in the reign. It doesn't mean promoted. It means that he had additional blessings, additional privileges, additional benefits that the king bestowed upon him. This is what happened to these three men, which speaks to how when you stand by faith, when you have the conviction, when you have the resolve, God will give you these awesome realities of how you have different benefits and blessings from him. So then in verse 28 it says, his angel, that's referring to the Christophany, yeah. Interesting, in verse 25 it says, the fourth like the son of some God. Yep. In the King James it says, like the Son of God. Correct? But in the word God, in the actual, the son of the sons of one, it's actually having the phrasing of one of the sons of God. That's why they phrase it that way in the Septuagint. It's a better translation. And then those are three different names. Yeah. So so the whole thing about this chapter you see here, you can see as we end the chapter there in verse 30, going into chapter 4 now, you can see how chapter 2 and 3 are both earmarks of chapter 2. Let's see the faithful one status of why Daniel is faithful and why he's looked at for who he is and how God alone gifted him. Look how he handled conflict. Look how he stood up with resolve and tenacity and conviction. And let's look 16 years after that, how he blazed a trail of testimony, of witness, and of laying down that light and salt of the earth, how to be that way, in which his other three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, now followed in line with that. And now we see them fully 16 years later coming to their own maturity of their faith, and we see it demonstratively being exhibited in front of Nebuchadnezzar. That's what we see from a spiritual standpoint of takeaway for us. On the good side. On the bad side, we see, God can work demonstrably in our lives and convict us in the person of Nebuchadnezzar and show us his sovereign will in our life, despite what we think what we do. And if we don't meditate on what he's done, and we don't remember the lessons learned, and we don't foster and gravitate toward developing and cultivating the lessons he's taught us, we're going to doom to repeat it. And not only that, you're going to go off the rails and get consumed with yourself like Nebuchadnezzar did, and 16 years later misinterpret the dream that he was given by then building an image of the very dream you saw. Are you kidding me? It's the very opposite of what you know is true. That wasn't the intent of the dream, for you to be stuck on yourself. It was to give honor to God. He told you, oh my gosh. Then you start putting mandates out to worship. It's so stupid. It just shows you how we lose our way when we don't focus and meditate and contemplate and reflect on who God is and what he's done in our life, what his word has to say. It took 16 years, a long time. But it did happen. When Nebuchadnezzar went so off the rails, he went to false idol worship of himself and demanding it. But then we see God giving him a second chance. And again, changing his heart. Did it twice. He changed his attitude and demeanor and heart twice. Chapter 2, angry. God stilled him. Next morning, hear from Daniel, he's fine. Here, chapter 3, he's angry, he's furious. God changes him. He alters his words, it says. God is showing you his sovereignty and his hand. It goes beyond human comprehension, goes beyond mental frame and emotional acuity. People say, I don't have a high EQ. I have a low emotional quotient. I'm not good with people. Are you good with obeying God? That's all you have to be, man. Just do what God tells you to do. Let him take care of the people situations. You see? That's all. And some people get caught up in this stuff. High emotional quotient people, it basically means that those who do well interact with other people, right? Take it up on social cues. But if you think about it, it doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted or whatever you are. If you have your functions about you, and you understand who God is and what his word has to say, and you just focus on that, then you'll be fine in the emotional quotient. Circumspectly, like the skutha thuno, see yourself, understanding how you fit in the situation, where your responsibility is, and you'll respond, you'll act, you'll think, and you'll stand with conviction and resolve like you should. And the emotional quotient, how you deal with people, will come through God's will and wisdom and truth, trustworthiness in your life. That's the lessons to learn from Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, so far. So we're going to continue on chapter 4 when we actually get back. We're going to take a break, just so you know. So this Friday will be, we have to go out of town next week for a time away for family in Texas. So we'll be gone. So I'll continue this after we stop in prayer, but I wanted to just put that out there. So with that being said, we'll pick up on chapter 4 in a couple weeks. When we return, I'll I'll give you the dates on that in just a minute. So let's close in prayer. So Father, we thank you for this time, opportunity that we have to gather with you. Thank you so much for your love and your provision and your truth and just the depth of appreciation for your word and how you intervene in our life and provide for us. Thank you for all you do in sustaining us and giving us all we need, what we need every day throughout our lives. Help us to take not just the knowledge of who you are, but to vet ourselves to see the resolve and conviction we need to have. Like these young men like Daniel at 16, or these older men now at 32, living with such tenacity, such resolve, such conviction, such filled with peace and yet firmness of unwavering spirit, of just filled with just the anchored truth of who you are in their life, and they would not deviate. Nothing would sway them. Only you and you alone, where they were just really anchored and just trusting in you as their foundation, as their rock. Help us be like that. Help us to learn these lessons and how to interact and react and respond to people the right way, and to stand for you in the midst of any darkness, any trial, any persecution, any hardship, any evil, wickedness done unto us. Help us to not ever look at them as excuses or deflecting or whatever that may be, but always look inside ourselves as to what you expect from us, what you demand of us, and what we need to give to you in return for all you've given us. And we ask all this to help us. In Jesus, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.